It is my pleasure and privilege to introduce this year's laureates of Sveriges Riksbank Prize in Economic Science in memory of Alfred Nobel. To David Card for his empirical contribution to labor economics, and to Joshua Angrist and Guido Imbens for their methodological contributions to the analysis of causal relationships. The contributions are separate but complementary. Albert Einstein said that the development of Western science is based on two great achievements: the invention of formal logical system and the discovery of establishing causal relationships by experimentation. There is no coincidence that experiments early become important in physics. Theoretical predictions are precise, and the same experiments can be replicated. It is not possible to carry out experiments involving plants, animals, or humans with the same credibility. In order to make progress, one must assess when an effect exists that differs from the natural variation in outcomes. The solution, developed by Sir Ronald Fisher, was the randomized experiment design originally developed for the agricultural experiment. Medical researchers were early adopters of the design. However, due to our consciousness, experiments on humans are more complicated than with seeds and plants. That is, the mere fact that we know we are treated leads to an effect known as the placebo effect. The adoption of double-blind randomized experiment in medical science has been an astonishing success for the society. However, due to financial, ethical, or practical constraints, most questions cannot be studied using the double-blind randomized experiment. Instead, causal analysis needs in large to rely on observational data. The crux with the analysis involving humans is again our conscience. The decision of a treatment, for instance, choice of education, may be related to the outcome on the study. If this selection to treatment is not acknowledged, the analysis will be biased. The work by this year's laureates laid the ground for the design-based approach in economics, for the analysis of causal questions. The design makes use of variation induced from nature, policy, or institutions as tools for random variation in the treatment and are known as natural or quasi-experimental designs. In a series of papers from the early 1990s, Card used quasi-experimental designs in analyzing a number of core questions in labor economics. By addressing these questions in novel and in a priori more credible ways, Card was able to produce new and more reliable answers. The framework developed by Angrist and Imbens in turn significantly altered how researchers approach empirical questions using data from natural experiments and with data from randomized experiments with incomplete compliance to the treatments. The approach has become dominant within economics and has spread to the other social sciences and also to medicine. As a result, researchers' ability to answer questions of substantial importance has improved tremendously to the great benefits of the society. David Card was born in 1956 in Guelph, Canada. He received his Ph.D. in 1983 from Princeton University. He is the class of 1950 professors of economics at University of California, Berkeley. So please welcome David.
To begin, I'd like to thank the Royal Academy for the honor of this award. I entered the Ph.D. program in Princeton in 1978. That was an era of great turmoil in applied economics. The previous decade of high inflation and high unemployment led to the rejection of the big macro models that were seen as a key legacy of the 1960s era research. The negative income tax experiments, which had begun with much excitement and strong support from both liberals and conservatives, ended with little fanfare but much disagreement about the findings. And several high-profile papers, including those by Chris Sims, David Hendry, and Ed Leamer, identified serious credibility gaps in many applied studies, particularly those based on macro data. Subsequent work in the mid-1980s suggested that the credibility gap extended to my field of labor economics. Robert Lalande's now famous 1986 paper showed that when state-of-the-art econometric methods were applied to the treatment group in the National Supported Work Demonstration, throwing away the randomized control group, They gave a wide range of estimates, and it was very hard to tell, without peeking at the real control group, which method or specification gave the best answer. A second revealing study was Greg Lewis's 1986 book on union relative wage effects. Lewis was the intellectual father of modern labor economics, having served as thesis advisor for Albert Rees, Gary Becker, Sherwin Rosen, and dozens of others, and having authored a 1963 book on unions that influenced many younger researchers. After reviewing virtually every study since his earlier book, Lewis reached the awkward conclusion that simple estimates of the effects of unions on wages were more useful and reliable than those based on state-of-the-art methods that were supposed to be able to isolate causal effects. The problem, in his view, was that researchers used arbitrary assumptions in their models with no concern for the validity of those assumptions or the implications of their findings. This criticism was particularly salient because many of the new methods had been initially tested on the union wage effect question. Around the same time, a study by DeWald, Thursby, and Anderson suggested that most published empirical estimates could not be replicated, and that many authors were extremely reluctant to share their data or programs. DeWald et al. Attempted to replicate the papers accepted in the Journal of Money, Credit, and Banking between 1980 and 1984. The journal had introduced a policy of requiring authors to archive their data and code starting in the middle of that period in July 1982. Even among papers accepted after that date, however, 1/4 of the authors failed to respond to multiple requests for their data, and a shocking 2/3 of the authors of earlier papers failed to respond. Only 2 of the 9 papers analyzed in depth by DeWald et al. Could be reproduced exactly. As they noted in their article at the time, these findings were not a real surprise. Most economists had a low opinion of empirical work. To quote Ed Leamer, quote, "We don't take empirical work seriously in economics. It's not the source by which economists accumulate their opinions by and large." End of quote. These developments really resonated at the Industrial Relations section in Princeton, where I was first a student and then a faculty member. Orly Eschenfelder, who had been my thesis advisor and was now my colleague and co-author, was the editor of the American Economic Review, which published the Lalonde and DeWald et al. Papers. In our 1985 paper, which coined the term difference in differences, Orly and I noted problems with the newest generation of models that were supposed to be able to separate causal effects from selection biases. We were also Lalonde's dissertation advisors. 10 years earlier, Orly had made a plea for the use of randomized trials to evaluate training programs. But the path forward for empirical work in other areas was also becoming clear. People interested in causal questions needed to shift attention toward more transparent and credible research designs that stated the sources of identification and tried to verify their truth. At the time, of course, very few economists used the term research design. My introduction to the phrase came when Alan Kruger, who had recently joined the Princeton faculty, started a subscription to the New England Journal of Medicine. Alan and I were intrigued by the abstracts of the papers, which typically had a sentence on research design. I remember thinking that none of my papers had a research design that could be summarized in a single sentence. Aschenfelder was not the only senior economist arguing for an emphasis on research design. Richard Freeman, one of Kruger's thesis advisors and the head of labor studies program at the NBER, had long argued for the value of what he called natural experiments. He also pushed the idea of looking for big shocks to help cut through the statistical noise that's so pervasive in labor market data. My first attempt to incorporate these ideas was my 1990 study of the Mariel boat lift. The idea of looking at the boat lift arose in discussions with a talented undergraduate at Princeton, Konstantin Alexandrakis, who was raised in Miami and wrote a junior paper on the episode. I had been working with my former classmate Joel Tonji on the labor market effects of immigration and was unsatisfied with the evidence we had been able to assemble. The Mariel boat lift seemed like a great case study to benchmark our estimates. My approach to the boat lift was very much influenced by my work on longitudinal earnings models with John Aboud and with Orly. Since the boat lift occurred just prior to the 1983 recession, it was important to build a comparison group of cities whose economic conditions closely tracked those of Miami in previous years, thus satisfying the parallel trends condition identified by Aschenfelder in his 1974 paper. The design of the comparison group was a natural outgrowth of the models we had been building to describe individual earnings, but applied to a city rather than a person. And the boat lift certainly met Richard Freeman's advice to look for a big shock. Next came work on minimum wages. By the end of the 1980s, several new developments led to renewed interest in this topic. In response to a decade-long freeze in the federal minimum wage, some states had raised their own minimums. This set the stage for natural experiment-style studies of the effect of minimum wages. Labor economists also had access to high-frequency data on wages from the current population survey, making it possible to study the effect of the minimum wage on wages. Surprisingly, this had been overlooked in the earlier literature. In fact, it was only in the mid-1990s that John DiNardo, Nicole Fortin, and Thomas Lemieux showed that minimum wages had a large effect on wage inequality. A third factor was the rising interest among economists in conducting their own surveys, an idea that Alan Krueger strongly advocated throughout his career. These ideas came to a head at a 1991 Cornell-Princeton conference, which featured some very straightforward design-driven studies of minimum wages, including my own case study of California, and a study of fast food restaurants in Texas by Larry Katz and Alan Krueger. Both these studies suggested that raising the minimum wage had, if anything, slightly positive effects on employment, the opposite of the standard textbook prediction. A third study I wrote after the conference, comparing the effects of the federal minimum wage across states, reached the same conclusion. While the conference proceedings were in press, Alan and I realized that an impending increase in the minimum wage in New Jersey provided the opportunity for a prospective study with both a treatment group, restaurants in New Jersey, and a control group of restaurants in Pennsylvania. We designed our study to mimic as closely as possible a randomized controlled trial, or RCT. The most compelling feature of the design was the fact that our hands were tied once we conducted the first wave survey. At that point, but before the increase in the minimum wage, the survey questions in the sample were frozen. I have since realized that many people really want other researchers' hands to be tied. The results of our New Jersey-Pennsylvania study confirmed the findings in our earlier studies, but also created a bigger stir, partly because our paper was published in the American Economic Review, and partly because the design was so easily explained to non-specialists. The findings were widely criticized by many economists, including Nobel Prize winners like Gary Becker, Merton Miller, and James Buchanan. Buchanan wrote, quote, "No self-respecting economist would claim that increases in the minimum wage increase employment. Such a claim becomes equivalent to denial that there is even minimal scientific content in economics, and that in consequence, economists can do nothing but write as advocates for ideological interests." End of quotes. Of course, the economist Joan Robinson had shown in 1933 that an employer with wage-setting power will increase employment if faced with a small increase in the minimum wage, a prediction that was widely understood even in 1994. So Buchanan was really arguing that any consideration of wage-setting power by employers was unscientific. That position has always struck me as illogical, but was very widespread. Design-based studies have several strengths that have contributed to their spread in labor economics and beyond. The most important is that they put causality front and center. In a design-based study, the issue of identification, which had been stated as a mathematical condition in older textbooks, is equated with the research design. This was clarified in the path-breaking paper by Imbens and Angrist. In many cases, a good research design also makes it easier to construct specification tests, like the pre-treatment comparisons now widely used in difference and differences studies. A second strength is that a simple research design is easily understood and interpreted by other researchers and by the policy community. In a 1987 paper, Aschenfelder noted that when the results of an RCT are presented, quote, "It is my experience that the discussion turns almost immediately to substantive as opposed to methodological matters," end of quote. A well-designed, non-experimental study can have the same effect. It can also be directly policy relevant. The evidence from one state-specific minimum wage increase, for example, can be understood by people in other states who are contemplating similar choices. A third strength is the portability of the design. This is important in economics because we are often unsure whether results in a particular study are specific to that context or will hold up more generally. Within a decade, the basic design of the Mariel Boatlift study was applied to mass migrations in France, Portugal, and Israel. Variants of the New Jersey-Pennsylvania border design have been applied by many recent researchers. By comparing estimates from the same design across settings, it is possible to reach much stronger conclusions and to convince the research community to take the results more seriously, even if they threaten the conventional wisdom. In most design-based studies, as in an RCT, the counterfactual for treatment is the state experienced by the comparison group. In my opinion, this is a strength, since it helps provide a clear interpretation of the treatment effect. Other analysts, however, including prominent critics like James Heckman and Angus Deaton and Nancy Cartwright, view this as a limitation. Some of their criticisms involve the philosophy of science, but there are three that are worth discussing on this occasion. One concern is that the treatment effect identified by the design is too specific. For example, people often asked Alan Kruger and me whether we thought the results of our study would hold up if the minimum wage were set at a much higher level. Obviously, we could not say. But even if we had taken a model-based approach and estimated consumer demand and restaurant production functions, it would have been unwise to extrapolate the results too far outside the range of the existing data. Any economic model is only a crude approximation, and the associated parameter estimates can only reflect a limited historical experience. This is more or less what went wrong in the 1970s when the macro models fit to earlier decades broke down. A second criticism is that design-based studies are oversimplified. Many studies use a single equation model for the outcome of interest with no explicit consideration of the process that assigns treatment to different units, or of how assignment is related to the outcome. Of course, there are well-developed templates for incorporating these issues, so this is really a criticism of how authors report their results rather than of the design-based approach per se. I think this criticism is also overstated. A paper with a straightforward analysis is still worthy of attention if the research question is interesting and the design and implementation are high quality. In such cases, subsequent researchers can and often will follow up with more complicated analysis. I tried to do that, for example, in my survey of the literature on the returns to schooling in the 1990s. A third criticism is that results from a simple design-based study cannot be used to evaluate scenarios outside the ones observed for the treatment and comparison groups. This is actually not always true. If an analyst uses a logistic model to summarize the results from a discrete choice study, for example, it is possible to predict the demand for other choices, including choices that do not yet exist, as was shown by Dan McFadden in the 1970s. Again, I think this is a criticism of the complexity of the analysis in some studies, rather than a statement about the value of a good research design, which is always helpful in obtaining credible estimates of the parameters of interest. Design-based studies are particularly useful for testing basic predictions of a theory, or testing between competing theories. As the quote from Buchanan makes clear, many economists see little need for such work. They have much greater confidence than me in simple working models that have never been put to a rigorous test. In such a conservative intellectual environment, transparent design-based studies can play an important role in opening the door to a new approach or a new class of models. That is arguably what happened as a result of our minimum wage study. At the time, most economists believed that market power and wage setting required a single buyer of labor. On the price-setting side, in contrast, it was well known that search frictions or heterogeneous preferences could give rise to some degree of monopoly power, even when there were multiple sellers of similar products. Although Alan and I thought of our work as trying to test between wage-taking and wage-setting behavior by employers, virtually no one changed their mind on that question when our New Jersey-Pennsylvania study was published. In our 1995 book, we tried to interpret our findings in the framework of a search model developed by Ken Burdett and Dale Mortensen, but that was ignored or rejected by reviewers at the time. Over the next 2 decades, however, Alan Manning showed that the Burdett-Mortensen framework could be used to understand many aspects of labor market behavior. Other researchers became interested in modeling imperfect competition in labor markets. There were many more empirical studies of the effect of minimum wages in the U.S. and other countries. And there was growing evidence of both legal and illegal mechanisms to limit competition among employers, such as no poaching clauses in franchise contracts and no solicitation agreements in the tech sector. The question of whether firms have some wage-setting power has moved closer to the mainstream. I am actually cautiously optimistic that in another couple of decades, the field of labor economics will become more like the field of industrial organization, where the existence of some degree of price-setting power is taken for granted. Another example is the 1993 study of displaced workers by Lou Jacobson, Bob Lalonde, and Dan Sullivan. This paper was one of the first in labor economics to use an event study design, an extension of the framework that had been developed from the training program literature. Comparing job losers and mass layoffs with coworkers who retained their jobs, Lou, Bob, and Dan showed that prior to the event, the two groups had very similar earnings. But after the mass displacement, the job losers had much lower earnings, suggesting that there were very large and persistent costs of job displacement. Subsequent work by Dan and Til van Wachter showed that the job losers also had higher mortality. Lou, Bob, and Dan's findings were very disruptive because they were seen as inconsistent with a model where each worker is paid her market wage. Prior to the mass layoff, the displaced and non-displaced workers earned about the same pay. But after the event, the job losers earned substantially less, just because they no longer worked at one particular firm. Their basic findings have been verified in many other settings and countries, and their event study design has become the leading methodology used by economists to establish causality. And today it is more widely accepted that an individual's pay is determined in part by who they work for. But without the innovative research design, that message would have taken far longer to get through. I hope that young researchers today can find some inspiration in these examples. Labor economists' interest in research designs evolved out of the realization that what we had been doing before was simply not working. We have made some progress. A compelling design-based study can provide convincing evidence that sometimes gets economists thinking differently about a problem, albeit slowly and with no guarantee of success. To close, I'd like to offer some thanks. First, I'd like to thank my wife, Cindy, for her many years of support. Second, I'd like to thank all of my teachers, including, in particular, Orly Ashenfelter, my thesis advisor, co-author, and longtime friend, for his many years of guidance and inspiration. I'd like to thank all of my graduate students and co-authors for all that I have learned from them over the years. And finally, I'd like to thank three economists who are no longer with us, Alan Kruger, John DiNardo, and Bob Lalonde, to whom this lecture is dedicated.